Chapter 22. The Path Ahead, Part 4. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows on the cold stone walls of the temple as Lucas, Mina, and Thomas stood in the dimly lit room, absorbing Torgar's words. The cleric's voice echoed softly, filling the silence that had followed his cryptic instructions. "You will find the hidden way beneath the city in the sewers," Torgar said, his eyes heavy with unspoken knowledge. "From here, you can access a great iron door. Walk for 30 minutes, and you will arrive in the sewers. The key to your next move lies in the cryptic messages about the Sent Ones. Follow them, and you will find the way back to the city. It is a path known only to the cult, a secret from the eyes of many." Lucas, Mina, and Thomas exchanged glances, each of them processing the gravity of Torgar's words. It seemed like the next phase of their journey was more tangled in mystery than they'd anticipated. "Understood?" Lucas said, his voice steady but his mind racing. He wasn't sure how to feel about their sudden involvement with the cult, but the urgency of their situation was undeniable. They needed to find answers, and if Torgar's information was the key, then they had little choice but to follow it. "We'll be in the inn in the Gates settlement for the next few days," Mina added, her tone firm yet thoughtful. "We need to figure out our next move and wait for our friend." Thomas nodded in agreement. "We'll stay out of trouble. For now, we'll focus on what's ahead." Torgar offered a stiff nod, his expression unreadable. "Be cautious. The path is not as simple as it seems." With their farewells said, the party left the temple, making their way back to the wild path that would lead them to the plateau. The sky had begun to darken, and the night was quickly descending. The road ahead would be long, but they were prepared. Mina took the lead, her pace steady, though her mind lingered on the conversation they'd just had. There was something unsettling about Torgar's calm demeanor, the way he spoke of the Sent Ones with such reverence. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something much larger than they realized. As they walked, the quiet of the wilderness wrapped around them. The path was rough, the underbrush thick and untamed, but their feet were sure. They carried with them the lights they'd purchased in the Gates settlement, their lanterns casting soft glows on the darkening world. The night air had a bite to it, and the chill seeped into their bones as they pressed forward. "I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched," Thomas said after a long stretch of silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Mina glanced around, her senses heightened. She had felt the same thing, but it was impossible to pin down. The quiet was unsettling, as if the whole world was holding its breath. "I know what you mean," Lucas murmured, though his thoughts seemed far off. He was still wrestling with the emotions from the temple, trying to make sense of everything they'd learned. The cult, the sewers, those cryptic messages about the Sent Ones. What do they really want from us? "I don't know," Mina replied, her gaze scanning the dense forest ahead. "But I think we're being pulled into something deeper than we thought. That Torgar, there's something about him that doesn't sit right with me." As they walked, the conversation turned to their options. The temple, the sewers, the cryptic messages. It was all too much to process in one go. They agreed they needed time to rest and plan, but the night was now fully upon them, and there was no turning back. The plateau, the inn, they needed to reach it no matter what. Then, without warning, the low growl of something primal broke the silence. Mina was the first to react. Her instincts kicked in as the darkness seemed to come alive around them. Two wild beasts, their eyes glowing in the faint light of the lanterns, lunged from the shadows, aiming for her. One was massive, its claws gleaming in the dim glow, and the other was smaller but fast, its teeth bared in a snarl. "Mina!" Lucas shouted. But she was already in motion. With a swift, powerful movement, Mina kicked one of the beasts square in the chest, sending it tumbling backward into the underbrush. The other lunged again, but she managed to dodge and strike with a magical burst, sending it reeling. "Get back!" she shouted, her voice fierce. The beasts circled, growling and snarling, sensing the danger in their prey. The party quickly fell into defensive stances, preparing for the next strike. Lucas stepped forward, his hands glowing with energy, ready to fight if necessary. But Mina's power was enough for the moment, the beasts unsure how to handle her force. Thomas, ever vigilant, scanned the surroundings. "We've got to finish this quickly. They won't give up. With a final, concentrated burst of magic, Mina sent the second beast sprawling into the dirt, its body stiff with the force of her kick. The first one, now injured and retreating, turned tail and disappeared into the darkness. Mina staggered slightly, her breath coming fast, but she remained standing. A sharp sting of pain bloomed in her side. She touched it and found blood seeping through her tunic. "Mina!" Lucas rushed to her side, panic flashing in his eyes. His thoughts swirled uncontrolled as he fumbled with his first aid kit. "Are you okay? Please be okay. You have to be okay." Through their telepathic link, she reassured him, her voice calm despite the pain. "I'm fine. It's just a scratch. Don't worry." He hesitated, his hands shaky as he worked to patch her up. His mind raced, the bond they shared amplifying his fear. But she was alive, and that was all that mattered. When the bandage was secure, they both stood, the tension of the moment finally easing. The beasts were gone, but the feeling of being hunted lingered. Without a word, they resumed their journey. The plateau was still a few hours away, but they walked on through the night, Mina's injury a silent reminder of the dangers that still lurked. They would reach the inn, and they would rest. Tomorrow they would face whatever lay ahead, but for now, the only thing they could control was the next step. By the time they reached the inn, exhaustion had set in. The warmth of the fire and the soft beds were a welcome relief after the tense journey. They shared their experiences with Thrain the next morning, but he only stared at them in disbelief when they mentioned the cult. "You've met them?" he said, shaking his head slowly. "I've heard of such things, but well, let me just tell you to stay far from them." Thrain took a moment to gather himself, then gave them some tips about the settlements. Stores to visit for supplies, places to find decent clothes. They would need new gear for the next phase of their journey. The next day would bring new challenges, but for now, they were safe, resting for whatever lay beyond the horizon. The days at the inn were long and uneventful, yet fraught with an underlying tension that none of them could shake. Thrain returned each day, his expression weary, his words a disappointment. "No news of my contact yet. Keep your heads low. We must remain patient." Lucas, Mina, and Thomas spent their time exploring the settlement outside the dwarven gates, though the once appealing notion of a leisurely stroll now felt oppressive. The air was thick with suspicion, and every corner seemed to hold eyes. Every shadow felt too close. Despite this, they had more than enough funds to sustain themselves in the urban sprawl. Mina, ever the pragmatist, insisted they take advantage of their time here to gather supplies, things they might need for the uncertain journey ahead. They purchased a few extra garments, new lanterns, and restocked on basic food and medical supplies. The settlement was bustling with vendors and travelers, and despite their unease, they had little reason to fear for their safety. But as they moved through the crowd, a persistent sensation gnawed at the back of their minds. They were being watched. Lucas, ever the thinker, couldn't ignore it any longer. His paranoia had grown unbearable. With his telepathic abilities, he began to scan the crowd as they walked, focusing on the thoughts of those around them. At first, it was just a quiet hum, mundane thoughts, idle chatter. But then, like a sudden crack in the sky, he felt it. Focused, intent, watching. He narrowed his thoughts to a single point, isolating the presence that lingered just out of reach. A woman, her movements too calculated, her eyes too sharp. She was watching them. And not just her. There were others. A group of men standing on the edges of the crowd, their attention locked on Lucas, Mina, and Thomas. Their thoughts, too, were like a cold whisper in his mind. The unbound. Cultists. His heart raced. He couldn't be sure, but the unmistakable sense of hostility was unmistakable. They were here, and they were after something, or someone. Lucas quickly shut down the connection, blocking the flow of thoughts, but the damage had already been done. He felt exposed. "Let's get back to the inn," he said, his voice a little more strained than usual. "Now." Mina nodded, sensing the change in his demeanor. Thomas looked around, his protective instincts flaring, but said nothing. They headed back to the inn, trying to keep a low profile. The weight of unseen eyes followed them all the way. That evening, in the dimly lit tavern, they sat at their usual corner table. Lucas's unease had only deepened. He couldn't shake the feeling that the cultists were still near. They were here, they were waiting, and somehow they were closing in. As they ate, Lucas's eyes darted around the tavern, his senses alert. The murmur of the crowd blended with the crackling of the fire, but every so often, he caught the flicker of an unfamiliar gaze. He knew they were still watching. It was when the food arrived, simple fare, but enough to fill their bellies, that Lucas noticed the subtle change. The scent of the stew had a bitter undertone, almost undetectable, but it was there. He hesitated, but with no reason to doubt, he took a bite. The meal had been prepared by the tavern staff, but a chill ran down his spine. His hand gripped the edge of the table, his thoughts spinning. Something wasn't right. Minutes passed, his vision blurred, his stomach churned. The once harmless warmth of the stew turned to fire, then to ice. He gasped for air, but it felt like something was constricting around his throat. His mind was reeling, spinning, a fog of panic and confusion clouding his thoughts. Before he could even process what was happening, the world slipped away. When Lucas awoke, it wasn't to the familiar warmth of the inn's hearth or the comforting chatter of the tavern. The air was sterile, thick with the scent of antiseptic. His body felt heavy, sluggish, as if the very weight of his limbs had doubled. A soft voice reached his ears. "He's awake." Lucas blinked, his vision still blurry. A dim light hung overhead, the outline of a small, tidy room coming into focus. His thoughts were scattered, foggy, and then the pain in his head hit, sharp and insistent. He groaned, turning his head to see a nurse standing beside him, her face gentle but professional. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Like I've been hit by a freight train." Lucas managed, his throat dry. "Where am I?" "A medic clinic," she replied. "You've been unconscious for several hours. You were poisoned. Nothing fatal, but you've had a rough time. 500 dumas for the treatment." He frowned, trying to remember. The poison. The food. It had been subtle, too subtle to detect. "The cultists," he muttered, his mind flashing back to the shadowy figures watching him. It was them. They did this. The nurse didn't answer directly. She simply nodded. "You're lucky you were found when you were. It could have been much worse. You should be able to leave tonight, but you need to rest." Mina was there, standing beside him, her face a mix of concern and relief. She squeezed his hand as he turned his gaze toward her. "What happened after I blacked out?" Lucas asked, his voice hoarse. Mina's expression softened. "You were poisoned, Lucas. You collapsed in the tavern. We barely got you to the clinic in time. The nurse here was able to stabilize you. But the cultists are still out there, and now Thrain's contact is even more urgent." "I know," Lucas replied, his voice steadying as his mind cleared. "We need to keep moving. We can't let them get to us first." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the threat hanging between them. By nightfall, Lucas was able to leave the medic clinic, still weak, but alive. They returned to the inn, more wary than ever. The cult had made their move. The next phase of their journey would not be easy. As they settled into their rooms for the night, the unsettling feeling of being watched never left. The cult's eyes were everywhere, and their next move was still a mystery. The next morning, the familiar weight of paranoia hung over the party like a storm cloud. Thrain had yet to return, but Lucas, still recovering from the poison, couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that they were being watched, by both the cultists of the Unbound and the Sent Ones. His telepathy had caught fleeting glimpses of their thoughts the day before, and now the unease settled deeper into his bones. By midday, Thrain walked into the tavern, looking more haggard than the day before. His face bore the unmistakable signs of frustration, but there was no anger in his demeanor, just resignation. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "Still no word from my contact. I've tried every angle, but it's like they vanished." The party had been anticipating this, but hearing it again still felt like a blow. Mina glanced at Lucas, who sat a bit more stiffly than usual, his hand fidgeting with the edge of his plate. He had recovered enough from the poison to speak, but the lingering fog of weakness remained. "You've done what you can, Thrain," Mina said, her voice steady and warm, offering reassurance. "If you can keep trying, we'll be grateful. We're just on edge right now." "I'll keep trying," Thrain said, his eyes downcast. "I can't make any promises, but I'll do my best. We're all in this together." Lucas, still keeping a watchful eye on the room, spoke up. "There's something else we need to discuss. It's about Lucas. He paused, feeling Mina's eyes on him as he continued. He was poisoned last night. It was the work of the cultists of the Unbound. They're after us, and it's not just them. There are other eyes on us, too. Thrain's brow furrowed, his expression darkening. Poisoned? Damn. I don't know if I can help with that directly, but I'm glad you made it through. We have to stay cautious. The cultists are still watching us, Lucas said, his voice low. But there's something else. There's another group I'm concerned about. The Sent Ones. I think they're watching us too, but I don't know what their interest is. They don't seem overtly hostile, but I'm not sure we can trust them. I know of the Sent Ones, Thrain replied, his gaze sharpening. They've been a part of the city's shadows for years, but they're not easy to understand. They operate in the underworld, and there's a lot of mystery around them. They've always kept their distance, but if they're watching you... They've been watching the cultists of the Unbound too, Lucas interrupted, his voice tinged with a bit of confusion. They're not acting like allies, but they're also not actively hostile. I'm just not sure what they want. Thrain nodded, as though he'd expected as much. The Sent Ones aren't the kind to act recklessly. If they're watching you, it's likely because they have some interest in what you're doing. But be careful. They're not a group to trust lightly. Can you tell us more about them? Mina asked, her brow furrowing with concern. And if you can, maybe give us some insight into the militia in Brimkoroth. What should we expect inside the city? How are the patrols structured? Thrain paused for a moment, clearly weighing the importance of this information. I can tell you this much. The militia in Brimkoroth is structured in several layers. They have the outer patrols, the more routine guards. But as you get deeper into the city, you'll encounter more specialized units, especially near the gates and the central districts. The patrols change shifts every 8 hours, but they're fairly predictable. I'll try to get a more detailed schedule for you, but for now, I'd say you need to be cautious of the militia in the upper city. They're more aligned with the Empire, but they also know how to keep quiet about things they don't want others to know. The information gave the party some semblance of direction, but it only added to their already mounting anxiety. The militia wasn't the only threat they'd have to contend with, and now there were layers of suspicion surrounding them. Well, that's something, Lucas said, glancing at the others. But I think we need to take extra precautions while we wait here. Keep watching the food. If we were poisoned once, we don't want to be careless again. Thrain gave a short nod. I'll go back to the gates again. Stay hidden, be vigilant. If you see anything out of the ordinary, make sure to keep your heads down. I'll return as soon as I can. After Thrain departed, the sense of waiting dragged on, the hours stretching into a tense silence. As the sun began to set, they gathered in the common room of the inn, each of them clearly unsettled by the events unfolding. The air felt thicker now, closer, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Lucas kept his mind active, scanning the thoughts of the crowd around them. It was a quiet hum at first, the usual bustle of travelers and vendors mixed with the background noise of local chatter. But then, as the night deepened, the presence of the cultists became unmistakable. A shadow moved through the crowd, and Lucas's mind flickered with an echo of thoughts. He zeroed in on the source, but it wasn't just the cultists of the Unbound. There were Sent Ones here too, their cold, calculating minds lingering like distant stars, tracking the cultists from the edges of the tavern. They're still watching us, Lucas muttered, his gaze flicking from face to face. And they're watching them too. It's like a game of cat and mouse. Mina's eyes darted toward the door, her fingers tapping nervously against the table. We can't keep waiting forever. We have to act soon. We will, Lucas said, his voice tight with tension. But we need to know more. We need to be sure. Thomas, always the practical one, leaned in. We can't let our guard down. We'll wait for Thrain. But if we need to move, we'll move. The hours passed, and as the tavern grew quieter, the sense of impending danger only deepened. Every meal, every drink, was examined suspiciously. It felt like the moment they let their guard down, they would be exposed. As they sat in the dim light, the weight of the unseen forces pressing in from every direction, they knew one thing for sure. They were no longer in control of the situation. Every choice, every move, was being watched. The hours stretched long, each second weighed down by the oppressive silence that blanketed the inn. The party remained in their rooms, nerves taut like bowstrings. The occasional clatter from the tavern below or muffled footsteps in the hall did little to ease their growing anxiety. They were being watched. There was no doubt now. Every shadow felt more menacing, every sound more suspicious. By late afternoon, the tension became unbearable. Lucas knocked on Mina's door, his voice low but firm. "Mina, you there?" No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Thomas, standing nearby, exchanged a worried glance with Lucas. "Try again," he said, his voice a mix of concern and urgency. Lucas knocked a third time, louder. "Mina, it's us. Open up." Silence. Without hesitation, Lucas tried the door handle. It was unlocked. Pushing it open, they found the room empty, except for a single piece of paper, neatly folded on the bed. Lucas picked it up, his heart pounding as he unfolded the note. The message was brief but chilling. "If you want her back, come alone. Dark alley behind the smithy. No tricks." Lucas crumpled the note in his fist, his jaw tightening. "It's a trap," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, his expression grim. "Of course it is, but we don't have a choice." He placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder, his grip firm. "I'll stay behind. If this goes south, we need someone who can pick up the pieces. Be careful, Lucas. You can't save her if you're dead." Lucas met Thomas's eyes and gave a single, resolute nod. Without another word, he left, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. The alley behind the smithy was shrouded in darkness, the faint glow of distant lanterns barely penetrating the oppressive gloom. Lucas arrived with his heart pounding, every sense heightened. He scanned the shadows, his telepathy reaching out, but the assassin's thoughts were a cold void, expertly guarded. From the darkness, a figure emerged, a dwarf clad in dark leathers, his eyes glinting with malice. Mina was slumped against the wall beside him, unconscious but breathing. "Good," the dwarf said, his voice low and gravelly. "You came alone. Let's see what you're made of." Before Lucas could respond, the assassin lunged, his short blade flashing in the dim light. Lucas barely had time to react, throwing up a telekinetic barrier that sent the dwarf skidding back. The fight was on. The alley became a battlefield, debris scattering as Lucas hurled whatever he could with his telekinesis. The dwarf was relentless, his blade a blur as he closed the distance again and again. Each time, Lucas deflected the strikes, but the effort was wearing on him. The dwarf was skilled, dangerously so. His blade found gaps in Lucas's defense, grazing him with shallow cuts. Each wound burned with a numbing poison, but Lucas forced himself to focus, his mind racing. He attempted to delve into the dwarf's thoughts, to force him into sleep, but the assassin's mental defenses were formidable.
But Mina, now awake, surged to her feet and delivered a powerful kick to the dwarf's back. He stumbled forward, eyes wide with shock. "That should have kept you out for hours," the assassin muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. "Guess you underestimated me," Mina shot back, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. The dwarf, realizing he was outmatched, turned to flee. But as he did, Thomas stepped from the shadows, his massive frame blocking the alley's exit. "Going somewhere?" Thomas asked, his voice cold as steel. Before the dwarf could react, Thomas's arm shot out, slamming into the assassin's chest and sending him crashing to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, leaving him gasping for air. Lucas, Mina, and Thomas stood over the fallen assassin, their breathing heavy but victorious. The tension of the past days had finally erupted, and though they had survived, they knew the danger was far from over.